Hey everybody, I'm super excited to be here with Tenae Stewart today. You might know her as the Witch of Lupine Hollow. She is a author, she is a practicing cottage witch, she is an astrologer, she's a spiritual coach, and she also just happens to be one of my favorite friends. So please welcome Tenae Stewart. Hi.
Hi, Mandy. So happy to be here.
So happy to have you. So if you are not familiar with Tanae's work, I'm going to have her links and everything down in the description. She does so much for the witchy slash spiritual community. She hosts these truly incredible summit. I think a lot of people who are in my world actually found me through you and through your summits. And so that's super exciting. But Tanae, I just wanted to ask you to talk a little bit about what you do in your own words.
Yeah. So, as you said, in my own practice, I am a cottage witch, which really just means that my home is like really the heart of my practice. But I work a lot with the cycles of nature, so the seasons, the moon. I work a lot with astrology and the cycles of the planets. And in my work, I'm definitely an astrologer. Like it's definitely a big part of what I do and informs a lot of what I teach on. And I really help people to connect with their intuition, to create rituals and practices that are right for them, and just really understand like how they can be a witch, be a magical person, be an intuitive person in a way that really works for them, that's really custom and really personal through their chart, but also, just through really figuring out who they really want to be in their practice versus, following a lot of prescribed rules.
Oh, like, and you know that that's my kink. So I love that so much. And that's probably why we get along so very well.
It's so true.
So you have one of my favorite kind of origin stories for what led you to the craft. And so I wanted to just ask Tanae, how did you get started on this path, on this magical witch life?
Yeah, it's so funny because it's such a like long, circuitous, like convoluted story. I definitely think like I think this is true for most people, like that I think I've always been a witch. Like I didn't become a witch, I discovered I was one. Because even as a kid, like I just felt really connected to the moon and the seasons, like my childhood bedroom, like childhood and like teenage bedroom, like faced where the moon came up. And so I would like always watch it come up. And it was just something that was always there. And I first was kind of exposed to the words to describe that really pretty young. Like I think I was probably like 11 when I first learned about like Wicca and things like that. And I was definitely drawn to it. I think I was about 18 when I first like officially started practicing. I've always like not quite been able to trace that thread, but I think I was about 18. So I practiced for a couple of years very quietly, very privately. I was really not out with almost anyone. And my family is not religious, really pretty much at all. But I was a pretty young kid, like into early high school. I went to a Christian school, and then years later, I worked at that school. I volunteered. I did not get paid, but I always said I worked there as an art teacher. And it was really important to me to like be able to be in these really great kids' lives and like be kind of an outside factor, an outside influence, because they were so immersed in their like, very kind of culty Christian existence. And so I was really worried for a very long time about like coming out as a witch, about people knowing this part of me, even though it was really not technically an issue in like my own family and community, which is kind of interesting. And then I actually stopped practicing in college because I was commuting really long hours and I was working and going to school, and like it just got to a point where like I just did not have time for really anything. And I got to this point, which I think is so pivotal in the work that I do now, where I felt like I just wasn't doing my practice justice anymore. Like I felt like I wasn't doing it right, but it wasn't even necessarily about the rules. It was more that I just felt that like I wasn't giving it the like respect that it deserved because I just wasn't doing it most of the time. Which is kind of interesting because now I have like a completely different perspective, but I think I had to go through that, to get to the perspective I have now. And so I actually like consciously stopped practicing for about 2-ish years. And I remember thinking that if I ever came back to my practice, then it was meant to be. And if I didn't, that was okay. And I had really gotten to a point where I thought I wasn't going to. And then I lost my house in a wildfire, and that changed everything. And so it was about 6 months after the fire that I really came back to my practice, and it was such a like fluky, synchronistic thing that happened. I really hadn't been thinking about it at all. I was very deep in my grief spiral. And the long story short is that my best friend and I were trying to decorate our apartment that we had moved into right after the fire, that we had just been like, shuffling around in for 6 months. And we didn't have anything on the walls. And so there was a craft store that was going out of business. And we kept going there to get stuff for the house on sale. And I found this palmistry poster that for some reason I was just like really drawn to, even though I didn't and still don't practice palmistry. Not something I really know very much about, but I was just really drawn to it. And I like carried around the store, and I remember saying in my head to whoever was listening, like, okay, fine. If I can find a frame that fits the poster, because it was a large poster, if I can find a frame that fits the poster, I will take it home. And so I went back to the like framing department that was almost empty. The store was like gutted at this point. And there was like 5 frames left on the shelf, and one of them fit the poster. And I was like, okay, fine. And so I took it home and hung it up. And I just started kind of like Googling, what's out there in the witchy world right now. And it had exploded so much. There was so much more information than there had been the couple of years prior when I'd stopped practicing. And I pretty much like kind of recommitted to my practice like right then and there. And that was that was like 8 years ago. That's my
Amazing.
story.
Amazing. Yeah, every time I hear your story about the house fire, it always kind of gives me chills because I know, what a horrific and traumatizing time. But I think it just illustrates I think for most of us, the path is so winding. It's like you try it on, something doesn't quite fit, so you kind of give it up, and then you maybe try it on a little bit of a different way, but that still doesn't fit. But it seems like in these moments, and that's usually a theme with spirituality in general, in these moments where life is truly just kicking you in the face, it's like it can rise up and just provide so much power and so much clarity and just a little bit of trust that, like, I don't know, like I already am not driving the bus right now. So like, let's just hope something's got me.
Absolutely. Yeah, and that was definitely where I was after the fire. Like I said, it was about 6 months later that I like really came back to my practice. And I mean, I always kind of say that I don't really remember that period anyway, so I don't know what was going through my head at the time. But I do remember when that happened, when I did come back to my practice. I remember just feeling like, oh, of course, like I haven't had a spiritual anchor. Like I have been going through this without any kind of without any kind of faith, without any kind of trust or like spiritual support. It was just I had people around me, although most of the people around me were also going through the same trauma, so that didn't necessarily make a big difference,
Yeah.
because we were all processing in our own ways. And so I had just been like so adrift for months. And yeah, just really being like, oh, of course, like the moon, the seasons, like these are the things that ground me and always have, even when I wasn't technically actively practicing, those things were still always important to me. And so now I kind of consider it like, oh, maybe I never really did take a break. I just took a break from the words and the way I described it, but those things that were really foundational were always there. And it was the fire that really brought me back to that, because it was such a traumatic thing and such a really like deep, profound loss, because, we lost the home that we lived in. It was my childhood home. We lost our pets. We lost everything we owned, which was, everything from, everything in my closet to all of our family heirlooms, like
Oh,
the you don't think about like everything that exists in your house.
no, not at all. you know, we live in an area where there's a lot of that as well. And there was only 1 year where it kind of got to a point where they put us on like alert. And I remember I was kind of going to try and find like what we would pack in case, because we had to like pack in case we were evacuated. And I remember kind of just being like I don't even know kind of where to start, right? Because there is so much that you don't think of, so things that are important to you, things that maybe have come with you through the years that have made it through so many situations. So yeah.
Definitely. Yeah. What I really found like immediately after the fire that I thought was so fascinating was that my mom and my dad and I, all three of us, we all lived in the same house. And we all had kind of a list of like, I don't know, maybe about 10 things. I probably couldn't even tell you what my full 10 were. There's a few that I still know, but that is a weird thing about loss like that like when something is truly just gone, like
Yeah.
you only have so much memory, like you only can remember some of those things for so long, even when they were so important to you, which is like kind of a mind fuck. Like it's very like you really realize like I don't know what's the right word, like temporalness, of everything, right? But we each ended up with like kind of a mental list of like about 10 things that we were truly, really, really, really sad about. And they were not the same things, right? Like we each had these really different experiences of what happened. And I just thought that was really fascinating. And you
That
don't realize what will actually truly matter until it doesn't exist anymore.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that is super interesting because there would be things where it would have different weighted importance for all of you.
Yeah, definitely.
Oh man. Okay. So yeah, so the in your opinion, what does, and I mean I can probably already guess because of this conversation we're having, but like what does it mean to be a witch and what can your practice do for you?
Mm, I love that. For me, being a witch is very much about like being connected to your power and to your intuition, like being able to trust yourself, right? Really knowing that you have ultimately really everything you need. That, any tools in your practice are extra, right? Like everything you have or everything you need is like what you have is within you, right? To whatever degree you have it, right? Like your own capability is exactly what you need. I don't know. I think that our connection to our bodies and our intuition is like really the most central thing to being a witch, as well as like the connection to what's around us, right? Like connection to nature is such an important part of my practice. And I find that that's something that's true in different ways for almost every witch that I talk to, like whether it's connection to the seasons or the earth or plants or the moon or whatever, like some connection to nature is like one of the few almost universal things that I hear. And it's definitely true for me too. So I think that like connection to power and connection to like what is here, is just really powerful. Um, in terms of what your practice can do for you, and I think that's such a great question because a lot of times we think of spirituality as something that's almost like, I don't know, like it's supposed to be what's like selfless in a way, right? It's supposed to be like we're giving ourselves to something or we're devoted to something. And I actually love the word devotion and I work with it a lot. But I do think there's something to be said for like having a connection to something outside of yourself, right? Something larger than yourself. Like I think all of that can be really important. But I also think that our practices should serve us. Like they should make sense in our lives. They should, bring us peace and grounding and connection and like all of these things. I don't think it's about serving something outside of ourselves. And so I think that your practice can really be this source of like source of wisdom, right? This source of, like you said, trust that you do have everything you need and that no matter what happens, that like you're going to continue to have everything that you need inside of you, right? And like, I mean, I'm talking very energetically, not necessarily physically, right? We can always create what we need physically. But there's obviously lots of like real world factors that go into that. But energetically, like even when your house burns down, like I still had everything I needed, right? It took me a while to find it again, but I did, and ultimately like what got me through that was not anything outside of me. It was like me finding my way back to being able to support myself, and being able to figure out what I actually needed and what I needed to seek out. I think that's kind of an important distinction with self-care, right? Is like we need to be able to give ourselves most things, right? Instead of searching for those things from other people. And also we need to know what we need to seek out, you know? Like I think sometimes we think those are like two totally different boxes. I think your practice can really help you connect those.
Oh, I love that. That's like such a phenomenal answer. I love everything about that. Because my perspective is very much uh focused on like mental health magic and like trying to stay sane in whatever the fuck all of this is. And I found personally the same thing, that it's like, you know, uh you can end up finding things you didn't know that you needed. And it's such a beautiful thing because it really does come from within or even without. I know some people work with gods and goddesses or work with spirit allies or all sorts of those things. But ultimately, you can't even really get to those things without strengthening that connection with yourself, right?
Absolutely. Yeah. And I definitely do work with goddesses, guides, like that's definitely a part of my practice, which is funny because I had such a circuitous journey with that too. Like
Yeah.
it was something that when I first started practicing, you know, as a literal teenager, like it was something I was really interested in. I had always been interested in mythology and, you know, goddesses, like, but it was something that I felt I think I felt like there was a lot of rules around it, you know, and it didn't feel like it was something that fit for me, even though I was really drawn to it. And so then for a long time, I very much practiced without that really at all. Like I always had some like ancestral connection, which is very related, but I never really worked with guides until I guess it's always funny because when I really try to like think of the like timeline of my practice, I'm always like, well, I think it started here, but it probably started earlier than that. I don't know. Um, but at the moment that I remember really starting to work with goddesses was actually my astrology mentor was teaching us about asteroids, and she was just looking at our charts and she discovered that the asteroid Diana, for the goddess Diana, is right like exactly with my moon. Which of course Diana rules the moon as well. And it was just this moment of very like it just really clicked and I was like, "Oh, like I don't know why that feels really important to me." And it was like from then on that I really started working more with goddess energy. And for me it's still very like archetypal. I think they still really come from within us in a way. Like I don't have this very like structured, fully formed, you know, thought process around like what goddess energy even is. I just think it's really powerful and important.
Yeah, absolutely. I can relate so hard to so much of that because I'm all like right now I'm actually in a little bit of that, a season of that myself, whereas I always really identified as more of a secular sort of approach and things. But I've recently had some experiences and started opening up to I mean, I always worked with like plant spirits and things like that. But like kind of trickster energy or like different types of goddesses, like really I've started kind of opening up to that a little bit more, which has been very interesting. So one of the things I wanted to ask you about is dark goddess stuff, because I know that's something that the listeners here are going to be super interested in, but I'm also very interested in it, and I know that you have created some offerings around that recently. And so I just wanted to ask about that.
Yeah. So it's so interesting because I feel like, so I made this quiz recently that was kind of came out of another offering, you know, things always evolve in their own way. And so I've been working with Dark Goddess Energy in my work a lot recently. And it's so funny because the most of the goddesses that I kind of put into this quiz that I made, I mean, I suppose this makes sense because I made it, but they're all kind of goddesses that I've worked with in some capacity myself, not necessarily in like a really deeply personally devoted way, which I don't think that we have to be like completely devoted to a goddess in order to work with them. I think there's some gray areas with that, and it depends on the deity and it depends on your own practice, but I definitely think that we can work with them as these energies and archetypes without it necessarily being like a really long-term relationship, as long as it's done respectfully, of course. And so the goddesses that I've been talking about lately are, you know, like definitely Persephone, who has been such a big part of kind of like my, I don't know, like I guess like journey to really what do I mean? I kind of want to say like getting my head around like goddess work. Like I think Persephone is such a good example. And I mean, it makes sense why so many people are drawn to her because she's so complex. You know, she has these springtime, earthly, you know, fertility goddess kind of vibes and these, you know, witchy, dark underworld goddessy vibes as well. And I think that's just really like, I think a lot of us are just really drawn to that it's like, yes, I can be all of these different things, you know? So I have talked a lot about Persephone for years. Like I've talked about her on my podcast and in lots of different spaces. But when I started thinking through like, okay, who are some of the other dark goddesses who are important to me for these projects I've done recently, there were more than I really kind of realized. And several of them are not the goddesses that some of them aren't even goddesses, to be fair. I tend to use the term very loosely and broadly. But a lot of them are figures who have popped up for me at different points. So like I've talked about like Melusina, who's actually a figure from folklore, which like I wrote my undergraduate thesis on fairy tales. So like that's my jam too. And my ancestry has references to Melusina, which is really, really interesting that like there's a line in my family that like claims to be descended from her, which is really cool. Like descended from mermaids. But so there's like all of these different little pieces. And what I really started to realize is that I think all goddesses are dark goddesses in a way, because really the idea of a dark goddess is, you know, a divine feminine energy from whatever source who, you know, kind of defies what we think that means, right? Like defies it just being the love goddess energy, right? Or the earth goddess energy. And I think that even Venus and Aphrodite can really be a dark goddess in and of themselves, right? Because we tend to paint these figures as very one-dimensional, right? As like just a piece of who they really are, when in reality, like that's not true in their own stories, and it's not true in any of us, right? And so I think that working with dark goddess energy is very much about kind of starting to piece that out, you know, and being able to see the complexity and the like ignored parts of their stories, just as we have ignored parts of our stories. I don't know. It's a thought in progress.
Yeah, no, it totally makes sense. So would you consider like dark goddess work or working with that particular energy or archetype, would you consider that as sort of associated or a part of shadow work?
Definitely. Yeah. I think that dark goddesses can be so helpful in shadow work because they can help us to, I mean, the reason why I love archetypes in general is because they give us something that we can like step into the shoes of, right? We can channel their energy. And what's interesting with dark goddesses in particular is sometimes like there's parts of their stories that are really unhealthy, right? That we don't want to channel, but they can also serve as examples of like for one thing, like maybe what we don't want to be doing, but also I think they can serve as examples of like, or maybe not example, but inspiration for like, how could we rework that, right? Like, how could we, like with a sort of funny example that I was talking about in the Shadow Work Summit a couple months ago, was working with Inanna, who I love and who I have actually worked with a lot. And like part of her story is that when she returns from the underworld, she discovers that like her husband betrayed her. So she like has him executed and puts her lover on the throne next to her. And it's like, okay, maybe we don't need to like be that extreme necessarily, but there's still a lesson in there, right? Like there's still a lot of things in there about like prioritizing our power and our sexuality and, you know, allowing some of these parts of ourselves to be at the forefront and like not letting someone betray us or go behind our backs, right? Like and that we don't have to just like turn the other cheek and be okay with it necessarily. And so I think there's a lot of lessons with dark goddesses that they can help us to see our shadows, they can help us reflect our shadows, but they can also, you know, serve as examples in so many different ways.
Oh, I love that. Oh, and I like that story. Good for her.
Right.
Um, okay, well, so Tenae, if somebody, say somebody is listening to this and they want to know how to get started working with dark goddesses, is there anything that you would recommend as like a starting point, aside from obviously really leaning into your intuition? Clearly, if if there is one of these goddesses that you kind of feel like a little mental niggle or pull towards, is that what else would someone do if they wanted to get started?
Yeah, I mean that's definitely always the like most important thing, right? Is like, do you feel called to this thing? Then you should go research it. Um, and I think that there's a few different sources you can look for. If you're like, I know that I feel called to this energy in general, but I don't know who exactly. For one thing, I mean, you can also work with like the archetype of the dark goddess. You don't necessarily have to work with a particular deity. I think that's always an option. But a couple of sources to look to. One is your own ancestry, right? Like digging into deities from your own cultures, no matter how far back those cultures are, right, can be really, really powerful. And thankfully, there are more and more resources and books about goddesses from all different cultures. So, looking to your own ancestry can be so potent because it's so grounding. It just like you tap into something that is just there inside of you. And so I would definitely encourage people to start with that. I would also encourage people to look at your astrology chart. So like I said, I connected with Diana through my chart. So there's lots and lots of goddess asteroids that you can look up. And if an asteroid is in a close place in your chart, so if it's like very close to your sun or your moon or your Venus or things like that, then that asteroid is important in your chart. It doesn't mean like if you're like, oh my God, I want to work with Persephone, and you look with Persephone asteroid and she's like nowhere important in your chart, like you can still work with her, right? Like, but it can be, so it's not a like, there's a, it's like rectangles are squares and squares aren't rectangles, whatever. It's like that, right? Or the other way around. Not geometry's not my not my bag. You know what I mean? But you can look to your chart, and if there are asteroids that stand out, that can be a tedious process, but it can also be really fun. You can discover some really interesting things there. So that's a really good place. So those are both like ancestry and your astrology chart are great ways to connect with things that are already inside of you, right? Like things that are already like there, just kind of waiting for you. But also, if you do feel just that intuitive pull, or you just somebody keeps showing up, or a certain symbol keeps showing up, you keep seeing a certain bird or a certain plant or something like that, look like what goddess is that symbol sacred to? There's so many ways that I think all of this energy is just present around us all the time. And it's just once you start looking for it.
Amazing, amazing. So you have a dark goddess quiz then that people can access, because I can put that in the description below. So if you're listening to this right now, you want to take the quiz, go ahead.
Yeah, absolutely. The quiz is really cool. So it's very like multi-layered. So the quiz gives you, there's I think 5 possible results. So it gives you a goddess, it gives you one of the like typical witch wounds. So basically like a shadow to work with and a goddess to help you work with that thing. So it's around like your inner witch, sexuality, money, things like that. So rather than just being like, here's a shadow, now go figure it out. It's like, here's a goddess or an archetype that you can work with, around healing this shadow. So it's pretty cool.
Oh, I love that. I love that so much. And that actually just inspired kind of another question here. So when it comes to the witch wound, can you tell me a little bit more about that? Because I think that's something that pops up frequently for a lot of us, especially given the fact that, in modern day society, we are in a climate that is not always super supportive for, this element of a person's personality or interest. So and sometimes it seems like it's getting worse, but then also it's also really great because there's so many resources out there. There's so many of us that can connect with one another. So it's definitely a mixed bag. But tell me a little bit more about witch wounds.
Yeah, absolutely. So witch wounds are basically, the idea is that during the time of the witch trials in Europe, right, which is couple hundred years realistically, and at least tens of thousands of people died. You know, the number, you see lots of different numbers, but a lot of people died during the witch trials. Mostly women, but a lot of men too.
Mhm.
And so the idea of witch wounds is that we have this like collective ancestral wound. So it's not necessarily about like, oh, you have an ancestor who, you know, died in a witch trial. Like maybe, and a lot of us do. A lot of us also have things on the complete other side, right? You might have witch hunters in your ancestry like I do. So there's definitely, you know, it can be literally ancestral, but it does not have to be. And I really do think that like through colonization, I think that this is really a global thing, that it's not necessarily about European ancestry either. But the idea is that because we had this massive, you know, very long-term like collective trauma that we've inherited, many of us have inherited these wounds that we call the witch wounds. And so witch wounds are basically shadows that come up that keep us playing small, right? That are usually they come out as some kind of fear or some kind of shame. And the most classic, of course, is like fear of being seen as a witch, right? Fear of like coming out and people knowing that you're a witch or knowing that you are intuitive or psychic or connected in some way, right? So that's like the classic version of it. That, of course, if, you know, 300 years ago, you would have been killed for being known to be a witch, like, of course, you're afraid of being seen as a witch, right? Like, it's very, very deeply ingrained in us. And I think it's almost kind of obvious, right? It's like, of course, like, sure, it might not be as present anymore, depending on where you are in the world, but it's still in our, you know, psyche. It's like still in our DNA, to have this fear. But it shows up in other ways too, right? It's shows up around money, it shows up around sexuality, it shows up around community and like sisterhood, because those are all ways that especially women were really kept small and controlled via the witch trials, right? It was like, oh, you had some kind of asset that someone wanted, well, they'll just accuse you of being a witch and take the asset, right? You slept with someone's husband, well, they'll just accuse you of being a witch, right? Like it's so many ways that it shows up. And so we have these like fears and shames that are just so deeply rooted that a lot of times we even rationalize, right? Like in the spiritual community, it comes up a lot around money. Like, oh, well, we shouldn't make money for our spiritual gifts. Well, that's because if you were making, you know, quote unquote, too much money from your spiritual gifts, someone was going to accuse you of being a witch and take what you had, right? So it's like, it almost becomes like really obvious when you start to see it that way. That's like, oh, of course we have these really deep shadows. And I think that seeing them in that context can be really helpful because it helps us to, you know, when you have a shadow and you have some kind of limiting belief, once you see the belief for what it is and you're like, what? Like, why? No, that's just not true. Why do I believe that? Right? Like, oh, I see where that came from. It becomes so much easier to actually move past it.
Oh God, yeah, absolutely. I could not agree more. It's so funny because the more work that you do on like your own mindset or like your limiting beliefs or like what you think to be true or possible for you in the world, um, it's so interesting because a lot of it is just so programmed and it's just almost like stuff we're installed with, whether it be through our you know generationally through our bloodlines, whether it be through our soul and like past lives, or whether it just be like the shit that we kind of take on, just absorbing the world around us in this lifetime, growing up through our parents, their shadows getting passed down, like shadows on shadows on shadows. Then there's the collective and all of it. And so it's so funny because when you start examining those beliefs, and if you just ask yourself the simple question of like, did I ever agree to co-sign this in the first place? Like usually the answer is no. And like most of it doesn't hold up to a shred of logic or thought, but then it just, because it's become such a felt ingrained body reaction, almost it's like anchored within you so much, it does take some work to kind of go, well, what do I want to replace this with that would feel more fun and more supportive?
Absolutely. Yeah, definitely. And I think that working with, you know, goddess energy or plants or whatever tools, archetypes, can really help you move through that, right? Because a lot of times we do that where it's like, okay, I see that this belief is limiting me and isn't doing me any good and actually doesn't make any sense, but now what do I do with it? And so I love to work with something tangible, right? Something in your chart or something that you can put on your altar that can really help you be like, okay, what am I replacing this with, you know?
Right. So I love that you I love your work with astrology. Like, you know, I'm not personally an astrology girly, but guys, Tenae is the one that has gotten me very much more interested because she called a couple of things in my life that were going to happen and they fucking happened. And it was a hard time, but I can't say I wasn't prepared, and that blew my fucking mind. So I just wanted to talk to you a little bit about astrology. So first of all, okay, I have to ask this first. So first of all, I don't know when this is going to air, but man, word on the streets is that 2025 is going to be a little bit of something. And so I wanted to ask, what are your thoughts on, I know that's kind of a loaded question. Like, can you please give me a forecast for 2025? But like, where is that kind of coming from?
Yes. So starting as we're recording this, Pluto
Yes,
has just entered Aquarius. So whenever
yesterday.
it comes
Yeah.
out, Pluto will still be there. So very relevant. So starting mid-November through 2024 through about July 2025, as an astrologer, I have never seen so many transits, so many massive transits in such a short period of time. Like I'm not I never want to be the like fear-mongering astrologer. And I actually don't think that it needs to be like a fearful thing, but there is like big fucking change. Like that's the main thing that I know. I don't know exactly because it's so many. I'm like, I can look at the individual things and talk about them, but I'm like, so many things are happening at the same time that I'm like, I don't actually know what that level of change really looks like in reality. But basically, what's happening is between November and July, every single outer planet, so Jupiter through Pluto, every single one of them is changing signs, as well as the nodes, which they have to do with eclipses. So our eclipses are changing signs. And every single personal planet, so Mercury, Venus, and Mars, will all be retrograde at some point during that time. It's like I've never it's so much. So the big picture is really big change, right? Change in like not necessarily every area of life, but like um I don't like every area of society almost, right? Like things are on a personal level, like things are changing in our relationships, things are changing around like what we feel really passionate about. But on the collective level, which because a lot of it is very collective, on the collective level, we're having a lot of change in just like if this feels so generic to say, but like change in society, right? Like the way that we look at maybe money, the way we look at like social justice, like the way we look at community, right? A lot of these things, and the way we look at like the individual within community is really starting to shift. And 2025 is going to be like the impetus of that. It's not necessarily going to be, I mean, definitely will be overnight change, but it's not necessarily going to be like okay, we know exactly what the change looks like now that July has come and gone because a lot of that is going to be like shifting back and forth. But 2025 is going to give us a really good look at like what those changes might actually look like in reality. So I feel like it's one of those things where I'm like, it's too big to even try to like really put into words and articulate. But on a personal level, most of the transits, almost all of the big transits that are happening between Pisces, well, through the signs, Pisces, Aries, um, really Gemini, Cancer, and Leo. So those are like the big signs where things are changing the most.
Mhm.
Especially Pisces and Aries
Okay.
is having a lot of big change. So if you have, you know, your sun, your moon, your rising sign, things like that in those signs, then it's going to feel particularly personal versus, you know, if you have like, I don't know, what's one of the other signs? If you have
Uh,
like Sagittarius
yeah.
rising, maybe it's not going to be as potent, but it will still be on a collective level, right? So if you have things in those particular signs, you'll feel it the most, but I think as a society, we're going to be feeling it.
Yeah, and I mean, I agree with you. I don't think it necessarily needs to be all bad. I mean, every day is bad and good for different people and different reasons all over the world, right? And so I think we clearly all more or less are on the same page that the way human shit works right now is probably not the best. And we probably shit the bed on several levels. And so, there can be a little bit of fear, but also a little bit of hope or excitement for, new paradigms are not born in times that are very easy and peaceful and simple. And so, yes, that does suck on one level, but on another level, if you zoom out a little bit, it's like, well, I mean, maybe we need to grit our teeth and really do re-examine the way that things work, the way that we live, the ideas and beliefs we have about ourselves and each other, and how we fit together as part of a coherent system, right? Which is really, I think the witches are obviously leading the charge there, just on the pure fact that that's kind of a very witchy thing, is to try and think of yourself as part of a larger system rather than somebody that is imposing their will upon everything around them, right? So not that witches don't use their will to make change happen, but I just mean more in the sense of like taking care of each other, being a part of this planet, all of that.
Yeah, definitely. And that's definitely a lot of the big themes that are happening, right? Because we have Pluto moving into Aquarius, which is all about totally like burning down so many things in society, but like burning down the way we look at community, and like finding community to be much more transformative and powerful than we've allowed it to be in more recent years. But then we also have a lot of things going into Aries as well. I mean, we have Neptune and Saturn will both move into Aries, and Mercury and Venus will both be retrograde there. So we have a lot of things happening in this energy that's all about individuality and passion and, the person, which I think in some ways will help balance the Aquarius piece, right? Because community is so important, and also we don't want anyone to get lost in the shuffle, right? In the whole. But there's also, I think, going to be a very like big tension between like being an individual and being a part of the collective. And I think that is very witchy, and I think that it's definitely not going to be super comfortable, I think, because it is a certain amount of tension, right? There's some friction there, but I think it's giving us the opportunity, like, okay, well, how can we sort that out, right? How can we be individuals within the collective rather than, swaying so hard to one side or the other?
Yeah. Oh man. Yeah, that makes so much sense. I think for where we're at and kind of the desires you can see in the collective of like what we would prefer versus, whenever you're in a situation where something is not working, it's such a beautiful way to get clarity, because you can at least say like, at least not this. Like, at least I know that this is a full body fuck no. So it's like it can provide some free up some mental space to start imagining, dreaming, creating, getting clarity on what it is that you would want, right?
So true. So, so true.
Yeah. So if in the next year, okay, so say over the next year, things are kind of tumultuous. People are going through these transits, trying to find their way. Would you have like one kind of brief or super helpful practice that you could recommend for people when it comes to trying to navigate self-care during times like that?
Yeah. I mean, I definitely find that working with the cycles is so helpful when things feel very chaotic and very like out of your own control, right? Where it's like, whether there's like some things you can focus on that are like, I can control this thing, so I'm going to put my energy there, or it just feels like there's absolutely nothing that you can control, right? Which I think that in times like we're currently living in, a lot of times it does feel like, okay, the big picture, maybe I don't have a lot of control over it, right? Or any. But I think that the cycles, it's almost like they don't give us a semblance of control because we don't have any control over them either, but they're so grounding, right? It's like, okay, we see the shifts from one season to the next, and we see the shifts from one moon phase to the next. And even, if you get into the astrology and you look at like the big picture of these cycles, right? Like when was the last time that each of these planets was in these signs? And you see these like really long-term cycles, right? I think that working with the cycles, whether it's, journaling, you know, doing ritual around them, or even if it's literally just like looking outside and being like, oh, it's winter now. Okay. You know, oh, it's spring now. Okay. Right. Like, I think that can be so deeply grounding because it is this kind of like almost like promise from the universe, right? Even though our seasons are changing and that's not always really great. Nonetheless, right, there are still seasons in some ways, even if they look different than they did when we were kids, right? Like as we're recording this, we're having like a historic storm. Like my whole town might be flooded. I don't know. We'll see what happens the next few days. That's not normal. So, you know, like I think that a lot of times when we talk about the seasons being grounding, we're like, well, what about climate change? It's like, yes, okay, that's a very real thing. And it is, they might look different, but we can still notice what those changes are, right? And we can still notice, it's just so much about awareness and noticing, right? And I think that that can be very, very grounding because I don't know, it is this like oxymoron because it's like, well, we don't have any control over it, and that is somehow comforting in a way. I don't know. That's my big thing is whenever I'm like out of, you know, just like off the axis, like coming back to the seasons, coming back to the moon is always my big thing.
That's phenomenal advice. One of totally a side note, but one of the most impactful dreams I ever had was I was at the top of the hill and I was with a few people and we had those like fold up chairs and we like folded them up, sat and watched the moon was coming and colliding with the earth. And it was the dream, the mood of the dream was very kind of apocalyptic and like terrifying a little bit, but mostly it was like awe. I was in awe. And it was funny because after that, that dream was so impactful. And after that, I was trying to like unpack, like, why is it like really staying in my awareness for so long? And I realized that seeing the moon move was the part of the dream because it caused this cognitive dissonance about this thing that is always there and does the same things being acting in an unpredictable or shocking way, and it like for some reason even as a dream it just broke something in there and it still is there like pretty much constantly, that feeling of like I can't process what I'm seeing even though it wasn't a real thing. So I think that you're completely right. There's these things where it's they can provide a grounding energy, not even just for us being in this lifetime now, but like for humanity, we have been looking at the seasons, at the stars, at the cosmic cycles, even astrology for so long that there is an element of predictability there, or an element of like, well, you know, at least I kind of understand or know what happens when, you know, you see these plants start to die and these plants start to come up and like things like that, which really helps you interface with your life, not only in a like mindful and present way, but it also is like, oh, I am part of this system, right? I am a conscious part of this system.
Yes. Yeah, I think that's such an important piece, right? That like, yes, it's very grounding and very mindful, right? To like know what's going on around you. And that can help with so many different things you might be feeling, right? But it is also that like we are a part of nature, right? We exist within these phases, within these seasons, within these cycles. And not only do they affect us, but like we just are inherently a part of them. And I think that starting to really have an awareness of that, and also like on the next level, like really pay attention to how they're affecting you and like how you feel when the moon is in certain signs or when certain seasons come along, you know, like I think being able to take care of yourself by knowing how you're probably going to feel and be able to set yourself up to, you know, take care of yourself through whatever that feeling is, I think is really, really powerful information. That's such a huge part of what I do. But I also think that just knowing that like you have full and total permission from nature to be in whatever part of the cycle you're in, and even these like overlapping cycles, right? It's just like, okay, I don't have control over that thing, but I get to be here because this is where I am, you know.
Oh, that's so amazing. I love that. That's such a great, that's such a great way to look at it. And it is so grounding, and it is nice to know that like a lot of the chaos we're seeing is human chaos. And there is so much outside of that, that we can kind of use as a touchstone.
Definitely, yeah.
So I usually kind of end these by asking a question about like conspiracy theories or cryptids or like aliens or something like that. But for this one, I have to ask, you talked about a character from folklore. Was it Melusina? Can you
Yeah.
tell me a little bit about, I don't know if that's like a huge broad question, but I'm so curious. Can you tell me a little bit about Melusina and yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so I love fairy tales and I love like folklore. And I think that there's so many reasons for that, right? Like I think they're really such fascinating like ways that we tell story and we talk about humanity and we talk about like all of these different topics that around like the divine feminine and intuition and magic and like I find them really fascinating. So Melusina is a really interesting one. So she's generally like from like French and Germanic folklore, although she has some connections to Scotland as well. And so the idea of Melusina is she is a mermaid. She's often depicted with as like a two-tailed mermaid. In fact, technically the Starbucks symbol is Melusina. Um,
Amazing.
but she goes back much farther than that.
Yeah.
So her story basically is that she is in the woods or by a lake. Like there's a few different like versions, right? But this man comes along on who's traveling through and he comes across her and they fall in love and they get married, but she makes him promise when they get married that one night of the month she will be able to bathe in private, that he's not to bother her, no one is to come in when she's bathing. And he's like, sure, that's fine, that seems reasonable. And so there's a lot of even just there's a lot of connections to like the moon and like women's cycles. Like there's some interesting stuff just right in that she needs like one night a month, right? But of course she's actually like turning into a mermaid on that one night a month. And she has these, obviously strong connections to the water element, which means also strong connections to like intuition and the moon, right? And so of course, like they've been married for many years and they have children, and he finally like can't take it anymore. And he like spies on her when she's bathing and finds out she's a mermaid. And she's like, you betrayed my trust. This was the one thing that you were never supposed to do. And so she like, there's a few different versions of the story. So the like kind of most classic is that she just like disappears and he never sees her again because he broke her trust, which I think is an interesting story in and of itself. There's also like a darker version where she like disappears and then like comes back to like take revenge on like him and their children and like, becomes almost more of a like Medea kind of a story. Medea, is that what I mean? Yeah, I think so. But mixing up my various folklores. But so there is like a dark goddess component in that. But I really the reason why I pulled her in through the quiz and I've been talking about her recently is that I think she's just really fascinating, that she has so much to do with like self-trust and boundaries and intuition and like there's just something really fascinating there. And of course I definitely have a connection to her because of this interesting ancestral piece too. But yeah, she's pretty cool.
Do you have time to elaborate on that? Because that's fucking interesting.
Yeah, okay. So my family, so my Stewart family line goes back to kind of technically the originator of my line is James Stewart, who was the illegitimate son of King James V of Scotland.
Oh.
And so then once you get to like the royal part of the line, it's very easy to go back hundreds and hundreds of years because it's all very well documented. And so King James's it's his great great grandmother, something like that. King James V's great great grandmother, I want to say. Her name was Jacquetta of Luxembourg, and she's a fascinating like woman in history. So part of her story is she was from France, from Luxembourg, and her family claimed to be descended from Melusina. But she ended up going to England, and she was married and then her husband died, I think, and she kept his title. It's still like very medieval. I think we're talking early 1400s, maybe late 1300s. I can't remember the dates off the top of my head, but it's like definitely medieval, right? Like pre-Renaissance. And so there's some interesting like rules. So she kept his title, which would not normally have happened. I can't remember all the details of that, but like even that is like makes her interesting that she like carried this title. And she ended up, instead of marrying another noble, she like ran away with a squire and they got married and they like lived happily ever after. And it's this like very classic like chivalrous fairy tale. It's very charming. But they had several children, and their daughter ended up marrying the king, and they are part of the originator of like the Tudor line. And so Jacquetta and her daughter Elizabeth were both accused of witchcraft at one point, but they were acquitted. So it's just a very interesting story. But she claims to be descended from Melusina.
Wow.
She's my
Oh,
like
that's so
16th great grandmother or something.
that's so cool. Oh man, that genealogy stuff is like fascinating.
It's so cool.
So cool. Okay, well, Tenae, thank you so much for coming. Can you just let people know like where to find you? I will have all your links and everything down below, where to find you, where to find your books, where to connect with you.
Yeah, absolutely. So everything is on my website, which is witchoflupinehollow.com. I'm mostly on Instagram at Lupine Hollow, so you can always find me there. I have a couple of quizzes, lots of resources and fun things on my website, and I host my program, the Starlight Coven Inner Circle, which is a really great space where we do all kinds of, we're going to be doing throughout 2025, we're going to be talking about intuition and goddess work and shadow work. So all of these things.
Oh, I love that. That is so amazing. Thank you so much today for coming. And yeah, I will talk to you later.
Thanks, Mandy.
Thanks.